Reggie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another one of my videos. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, I want to officially invite you to go ahead and hit the subscribe button because we try to help you make sense of comic book collecting, and we are going to do that very thing in this video. Over the last few weeks and probably the last 2 months, I have been getting a lot of questions and comments from people that are either new in the hobby or newly returning to the hobby. There are folks that are right now cracking open their comic book bins that they haven't touched in 20, 30, and in some cases 40 years. And literally every other day, I'm getting a message from somebody that is either new or newly returning. And I honestly find this to be invigorating. But to that point, there are a lot of folks that are asking questions that haven't seen some of my older videos. So what I wanted to do was to try to record this video where I answer the question at a high level and then kind of guide people to some of the other videos that are a little older that go into a lot more detail. The question specifically that I've been getting from people is, when do you send a book into CGC? What triggers do you look for to send a book into CGC? How do you decide what book to send into CGC or CBCS or EGS, right? The question comes in many different forms about many different grading companies, but essentially they're all asking the same thing. When do I submit? And again, I have videos on the channel that look at different parts of this, but not necessarily one that lays it all out. So that's what this video is essentially going to do. So without any further ado, I want to give you the very simple math that I use. And the math is this. You look at the value of the comic, you subtract the cost for getting that book graded, and if the number is positive, then maybe you submit. If the number is negative, then maybe you don't submit. Now, that math is super simple, but what I want to do in this video is to provide you with some additional context and additional details for that simple methodology that I just kind of identified. I want to give you some exceptions to the rule, and then I also want to illustrate a few examples for you to consider. So the first thing that I want to talk about are the costs associated with grading. And there are several direct and indirect costs associated with getting a comic graded that you want to factor in. In this section, a lot of my examples are probably going to be drawn from CGC because that is the third-party grading company that I have decided to go with. I've used some others in the past like EGS, for example, but I primarily use CGC. That is not to say that's who you should use. You're going to have to evaluate the different service offerings from these grading companies and decide what makes the best sense for you. With that said, one of the first things that you have to factor into getting a comic grading is the cost for grading, right? You have to determine that. One of the cool things about all of these different grading services is that they all have estimates for cost on their website. When it comes to a CGC, when you go to plug in a comic to get it graded, the portal will actually give you an estimation based upon your input on what the cost is for getting that book graded. So that's a very helpful thing to actually have because you kind of know going in what you're looking at. Now, with that said, the cost for grading is driven by the tier. The tier is driven by the age of the comic and the value of the comic. For example, a modern comic that is valued less than $200 will be a specific tier. A Silver Age comic from the 60s that is more valuable than that, let's say it's $400, $500, is on a different tier. So depending upon the age and the value of that comic, that will drive the tier. The tier will drive the grading cost. That is a very important thing. The next thing that you have to look at are the services that you need. By services, I mean things like cleaning and pressing. So for those that are watching this that may be new to this whole thing, a book that is cleaned is typically pressed, and a book is never pressed unless it is clean, right? So just be super clear about that, because that is a question that I get. But there are costs associated with cleaning and pressing that you should be aware of, and each company does it a little bit different in terms of the cost and also the criteria. CGC has a certain minimum for certain books that will have to be cleaned and pressed in order to qualify for a quick press, for example. And again, the portal will give you a lot more detail than what I'm actually going to give you here. But you have to look at the services. So if you want to clean and press, there is a cost for that. If you want to have restoration removed, there is a cost for that. If you want to have the book, the signature on the book verified by CBCS, for example, there is a cost associated with that. And I'll also note here that CGC does not do signature verification. A book that is sent in, that is signed, will get a green label, not a yellow label, which is typically attached to a comic that has been witnessed by CGC to have been signed. So just be aware of that. But the services will drive, again, your costs. So there's the grading costs, there are the services costs, there are also shipping costs as well. And there are two types of shipping. There is the outbound shipment of the comic to your grading company, and then there is the return shipping of the comics back to you. For example, if you send in a modern comic and a Silver Age comic, those comics are on two different tiers. That will result in two different shipments back to you. It might be one outbound shipment where you put both books together, but when CGC sends it back to you, for example, it will be two separate shipments, two different costs. So you definitely want to be aware of the costs associated with shipping, because that is something that should be factored in. Another thing that you have to consider is your acquisition cost. Depending upon when you acquired your book, you may have to factor that into your math. If you bought the book back in the day, maybe you paid 10 cents or 12 cents, or maybe you don't even remember, and that's actually okay. But if you bought a book recently and you paid $100 or $1,000 or whatever, you definitely want to factor that into your math, because when you do the value minus the cost, that is a big driver. Again, especially if you bought this book recently, that is something that should be considered. Another maybe indirect thing associated with a submission is the timing. And by timing, I mean the time in which it takes for a book to be sent off to a grading company and for that book to actually come back. Timing is an indirect cost that should be considered, and I'll actually talk about that more in a few minutes. And one of the very last things that you might want to consider when it comes to cost is the membership fee. And I've kind of mentioned this last because a lot of the grading companies are actually waiving their membership fees right now. Others still charge them, especially if you go with one of the better tiers and get some of the additional perks like discounts and things like that. I personally go with the middle tier at CGC. The middle tier will cost you $149. The great thing is that you get a credit for $150. This is a credit that goes on your account. You won't see it inside the portal. It goes on the account. The good news is that you get it every single year, even if CGC discounts your renewal. So in subsequent years, they will maybe charge you, instead of $149, they will charge you $120, but they'll still give you the $150 credit on your books. That is good enough to get several different books graded every single year, essentially for free, right? But depends upon how your mind works. You may want to factor in membership costs into your overall cost number as well. So in this next section, when it comes to value, there, of course, like the last section, is a video on the channel that goes into this in a little more detail. The very first thing that I always tell people about determining the value of the comic is that you have to do a grade. You have to determine a grade of this comic in order to make the math work. And I typically recommend something that I call a dirty grade. And it is a rough guesstimation of a comic's value by doing a rough grade evaluation of that book. And so you basically look at the raw book in your hands and you evaluate that book based upon maybe some other books that you've observed out there to determine what grade you think that this book is going to land on when it is ultimately graded by the grading company, because that is going to be important for you to determine to make the math work. And one thing that I will tell you is that grading can be a little tough. The more you do it, the more books you touch, the more books you grade, the better you will become at it. It is definitely a skill, and there are several videos on the channel that will help you with this. There is one on dirty grading, but then there are other videos in which I talk to the head grader at CGC about how to properly grade a comic. And by watching these videos, it should put you in a much better position to be able to do a dirty grade of a comic yourself. But once you master the skill, it's like everything else is smooth sailing after that. But let's say that grading your own comic isn't something that you want to do. That's actually okay. There is an app out there called Spot On Grading System that you can actually download to your phone. And by answering a series of questions, I think there's like 30 some odd questions, this software, this app will actually give you a rough grade of your comic. And this is something that I've been meaning to create a video on. I just haven't gotten around to it, but a Spot On Grading is something that you can download to your phone. You can make use of it, and hopefully it will actually help you to be able to get comfortable with determining a grade for your comic. But regardless of how you do it, whether it is through my methodology of dirty grading or this app, you get a grade. Once you have a grade, you then have to use some kind of valuation system. I personally recommend Go Collect, but there is also GPA, and then there's also eBay. And sometimes I do use a combination of Go Collect and also eBay to kind of determine the value of the comic that is in my possession. And I do that because right now, values are crazy and comics are going for crazy amounts of money, and I want to make sure that I understand, how much this comic is actually worth. So you determine the grade, you then look it up in one of these pricing platforms, right? Ideally Go Collect or GPA and possibly even eBay, and you determine based upon that grade the value of that comic. You now have basically your equation. You have your cost and you have your value, and you can subtract the cost from the value to determine whether the number is positive or negative. Now, when it comes to that output, if the number is positive, then you may want to consider sending it into CGC. But as I alluded to before, there are some exceptions. There is a time element that is, I think, really critical. Again, whether you're talking about any of these grading companies, if you send in a book to be graded, it will take some time for that book to be graded and come back to you. If your intent is to sell that book, for example, you have to really consider the turnaround time. If you send that book in and it takes 3 months, 4 months, 5 months to get that book back, the question you have to ask yourself is, what will be the value of that comic by that point? It could be higher, it could be lower, it could be negative by the time you get it back, depending upon what the book is that you're actually submitting. So you have to consider the comic that you're sending and the turnaround time for the grading company that you select. And you have to ask yourself some tough questions as to what will the market look like. If the number is positive, again, and you factored in time, you still might not want to submit the book, because how positive is the number? If the book that you are sending in is positive $50, is it worth it? Is it meaningful to send it in when you might be able to actually sell that book raw and make a nice profit without having to incur the cost of getting it graded? That is something to consider. Sometimes maybe just selling a book raw is the best way. Maybe getting that book pressed and selling it raw is the right way to do it, especially if you're going to only make a couple of bucks after doing all that work to, estimate the grade and do this math and plug it into the submission portal and send it off and then wait for it to come back and pay for shipping twice, only to pay for shipping a third time when you send it to somebody. You have to decide what is a meaningful amount of profit to make it worthwhile. Now, if you are doing this and you plan to keep the book in your collection long term, then the time might not matter. The amount of profit may not matter if you're planning to keep the book long term. So I just want to offer this up for context. On the other side, let's say that you do the math and the number is negative. That doesn't automatically mean that you don't send that book in. And I say that because sometimes you're sending a book in for sentimental purposes. Maybe the book reminds you of your significant other. Maybe it reminds you of your mother or grandmother or grandfather or your father or something like that. Even if the number is negative, that is not automatically a disqualifier for getting that book graded, because there are lots of reasons that people actually grade comics outside of just the dollars and cents. Sometimes it's about the sentimental value. Sometimes it's just about simple preservation and or protection. So again, I kind of offer these things up for people to be thinking about and to consider, so that you can decide what actually makes the most sense for you. Personally, when it comes to what I do, I try to look for a healthy return. If we're talking, $150 or $100, then that might not be a book that I send in. Maybe I just set that book to the side and I hold it to see how the market performs, and then decide later on if the value of that book goes up. Maybe I send that book in. Maybe I just sell the book raw. But so much of what I've outlined thus far is a maybe, because every situation is a little different, right? You have to look at that book and you have to ask yourself, what condition is this book really in? What grade might this book get after it is cleaned and pressed? What does the sales data look like for this book in terms of value? Is it meaningful? Does it make sense? What happens if my grade is off plus or minus one full grade or a half grade? That could be detrimental in some cases. The difference between a 9.6 and a 9.8 is meaningful in a lot of different ways. But again, so much of it also depends again upon the book. If you have a really amazing Silver Age comic, being a grade or half off really does not matter, because the value of that book is so significant that it outweighs the cost associated with getting that book graded. So as I mentioned, I'm actually going to move into a few examples. I hope that you will find this next section of the video helpful. So in this portion of the video, I want to take some time to look at some specific examples. And we're going to look at a modern book, and we're also going to look at an older book, and we're going to look at using some of the resources that were mentioned earlier in this video. For the sake of the modern book and the first example, we're going to talk about this book right here, Amazing Spider-Man issue number 55. This is the second print by the talented Patrick Gleason. This book is super hot right now, and we're going to look at this one as our modern example. And to do this properly, we are actually going to start off by first looking at the values associated with this specific comic. And I have taken a close look at this book, and what I have deemed is that this book is probably going to be a 9.8. It probably needs a press, but I feel very comfortable with the fact that this book can probably come back at a 9.8. But we are going to look up the values of this book using Go Collect. So I just typed in Amazing Spider-Man issue number 55 into the Go Collect portal, and you can see some of the books here that correspond with that search term. And we've located the book right here. This is the 2021 Amazing Spider-Man issue 55, second print, not the Virgin, but the regular. So we're going to go ahead and click on that. And once this renders, we're actually going to see here that this book at a 9.8 has an FMV of $60. There have been 10 recent sales at a 9.8, which is not a whole lot, right? That is something to definitely take note of, is that there are not a whole lot of sales at a 9.8 of this book, and certainly not a whole lot of sales overall. So again, just important things to look at as you're digging into some of the data. But when we expand this, I'm actually going to blow this up for you guys a little bit here. What you can see is that at a 9.8, there have been some recent sales. The most recent is $60 on 4/16. On 4/15, there was a $66 sale. On 4/13, $60. And before that, $67. So I feel pretty comfortable just saying that the value of this book is the FMV at $60 at a 9.8. Certainly, if this book goes to CGC and does not come back at a 9.8, you can see that that would be detrimental. So being able to decide what is and isn't a 9.8 in this example is vitally important, because if it comes back at a 9.6, the value of this book could be roughly $38. And that is probably not going to be a good thing. You can see here that there have been some sales at $35 and $41. So just kind of take note of that. This big delta between a 9.8 and a 9.6 is definitely a critical thing. So let me go ahead and shrink that back down. And I'm going to toggle here and go over to the CGC portal. And we're going to go to the portal because we're actually going to look at the costs associated with getting this modern comic graded. And we are not going to plug all the information into the portal. We're just going to use some of the data that is readily available to us. And if you go to submit, and you click on services and fees, what you can do is access some of the fees associated with a submission. What you should note here is that this does not take into account any kind of discounts, either credits that are on your account or discounts that are applied based upon the tier that you select for your membership. So these are just straight costs, so just be aware of that. But what we see here as we expand and look at this is that a modern comic that is younger than 1975 has a max value of $200. This book basically at a 9.8 has a value of $60. So we are well below that max tier of $200. We can see that our cost to get this book graded is $20. And you can see the turnaround time here as of when I'm recording this video. So our first cost is $20. So let's make note of that. Next, we want to assume that this book actually needs a press. And I can tell you by looking at this book, there is a pressable defect. And you probably will not be able to see it. There is a pressable defect right here. There is a vertical indentation in this book that needs to be pressed out. It does not break color, but it is a noticeable defect that will prevent this book from getting a 9.8 if not pressed out. So we're going to click on CCS pressing, and we're going to go over here. And what we are going to assume is that we are going to send in a stack of books. So let's just assume that to keep the math simple for myself. And to that point, we're going to do a quick press, which has a minimum of 15 books for the submission, a max value of $200. The cost associated with this is $8. In the event that we were only going to send a single book, you would scroll down here and look at the full press modern tier, and you would see that your cost is actually $12 versus $8. When I send in modern books, I tend to try to send in 15 or more so as to take advantage of the lower quick press cost. Yes, I actually pay more overall, but again, the $8 per book is a little more attractive for me than the $12. So that's part of the reason why I do that. So we now have two of our costs. We know that our grading cost is $20. Our cleaning and press cost is $8. Our acquisition cost is another that we had to evaluate. In this book, I was fortunate enough to get it for cover price. The cover price is $3.99 for this book. And then let's assume, for the sake of simplicity, that our shipping costs are only $10, $5 to send it, $5 to receive it. The truth is it's probably going to be more than that on both sides. But again, simple math. So at this point, we basically have all of our numbers. And when you total all of that up, what you realize is that your total cost is $41.99 against a value of $60. If you do the math, you basically have a profit of about $18.01. The question that has to be asked is that a meaningful amount of money? Is that a meaningful amount of money to warrant sending this book off to CGC? Maybe it is for some people. They want to go ahead and do that. For others, it might not make a whole lot of sense, especially if the book that you have might actually fall to a 9.6. And if that happens, you're definitely going to be in negative territory given the cost associated with getting this book shipped out, graded, clean pressed, and all that kind of stuff. All right. So what I decided to do was to take it a slight step forward. And what I mean by that is that you might actually be able to pick this book up already graded for a couple of bucks. And so I went over to the website here to eBay. And if you type in, if I can get my keys to work, Amazing Spider-Man, Spider-Man 55, CGC 9.8. Going to go ahead and search for that. And what we see here is that we can actually pick up this exact book already graded at a 9.8 for $65 plus shipping. Again, our cost is $41.99, and we can get one already graded probably in a matter of days for $65 plus shipping. So that's not necessarily a bad deal. So these are some of the things that you want to think about. Does it make sense, given the profit margin, given what your book might look like, given what you actually need to get it graded and all that kind of stuff? Does it make sense to actually send it off and wait a few months for it to come back versus just buying one that is already graded? In this situation, I personally would not send this book to CGC. I personally would just go ahead and buy a copy already graded and be done with it and not have to worry about it. But that is my personal preference. You'll have to decide what actually makes sense for you. So given that, we are actually going to look at another example. And I decided to cheat a little bit on this one and decided to use a graded comic for our second example, specifically Doctor Strange issue number 169. This is a book that I picked up from an LCS raw. I sent it off to CGC. I had it graded, clean pressed, all that stuff sent back to me. Really cool book. The first Doctor Strange in its own title. I just thought it was a cool book that, again, I was able to pick up for just a couple of bucks from my LCS. But you can see that that is a 6.0, which is roughly what I thought that the book was going to be when I sent it off. So let's basically do the exact same thing. Let's assume that this book was raw and that we looked at it, we did a dirty grade, we decided that the dirty grade of this book is indeed a 6.0. So let's go ahead and look it up, right? So Doctor Strange issue number 169. Let's go ahead and toggle for the value here. And what we see when this page pulls up, a 6.0 has an FMV of $260. Most recent sale was in April. There have been 25 sales in recent history. So we're going to go ahead and expand that and look at the data. What we see here is that there have been some recent sales on 4/13 and 4/12 for $300. And then the other sale was $330. Before that, it was $312. Before that, it was $210. So maybe this book is on the upward swing. Maybe we're experiencing some good sales because we're getting closer to a Doctor Strange movie or something like that. But the value is somewhere, I'm guessing, between the $260 FMV and the most recent sale of $300. So let's just assume that that makes sense. But let's take a look here really quickly at a 6.5. 6.5 has an FMV of $300, and the most recent sale was $375, which is not bad at all. And then let's go ahead and look at a 5.5. You can see that this book has an FMV of $230, recent sales of $197, $225. So again, when you're doing a dirty grade and you're evaluating a book that is in your collection, it's very helpful to ask yourself what happens if you're off plus or minus, because you want to have those numbers. You want to have that data in your head as you start to look at your cost and you start to do your math. But again, we are going to assume that this is going to come back at a 6.0 and that based upon the data, the value is somewhere between $260 and $300. So let's just assume that. All right. So now that we have that cost, let's come out of here and we're actually going to go to the CGC website and do what we just did a few moments ago. So let's back up and go to CGC grading, and we're going to look at the cost. So you have a couple of options. This book is clearly not a modern book, given that it was released in 1968. So modern is out, but you have a lot of options here, right? You have a walkthrough and express, which you can probably eliminate because we are not local to Florida to do the walkthrough. Express doesn't make sense given the value of this book. So you're left with three options: value, economy, and standard. The value tier is probably out because we believe, based upon our dirty grading, that this book is going to come back at a 6.0. The value, max value for the value tier is $200. This is not an option to us. So we have economy and standard. Standard would be a great option because you have a ceiling of $1,000. You have fast turnaround time, but that cost at $65 is not necessarily an attractive thing. If this book was closer to $1,000, it might make sense, right, to go ahead and send it in. But for this example, it might make more sense to do the economy. You have a ceiling of $400, a cost of $38, and you have a turnaround time of 77 days, which is not great. So 77 days is a healthy amount of time. So we are going to go with the economy tier and this cost of $38. The next thing that we have to do is to do a press. This book is going to need a clean and a press, and it won't be a quick one because it's an older book, has more defects, more dirt, more grime. We want them to take some extra time. So we're going to go ahead and click on CCS pressing, and we're going to scroll down and we're going to find the economy tier for pressing. Max value $400. We're good to go. Even if the book goes up to like what, a 6.5, maybe even a 7.0, we might still be okay at $400 based upon what we just looked at a few moments ago. The cost here is $40. It also has a turnaround time of 110 days just for the press. So again, the turnaround time is something to be aware of, because let's say that this book was hot right now and the value was high because of spec, and 110 days plus 77 days for grading, this book may cool off. So it's important to look at that time the same way that we talked about earlier in the video. So we're looking at about $40 to get this book graded, cleaned, and pressed. I'm sorry, get it cleaned and pressed, about $40. All right. So we now have two of our costs. Let's assume that I bought this book for raw for $100. And let's assume, again, for the sake of simplicity, that our cost to ship this book out is only going to be $10. $5 to send it, $5 to get it back. When you add that up, you basically are left with a cost of $188 against a value of somewhere between $260 and $300. When you do the math on that, your profit is somewhere between $72 and $112. So with that, you're going to have to decide, does it make sense to actually send this book off to CGC? Maybe you have some sentimental attachment to this book. Maybe it's your favorite character and the profit doesn't necessarily matter. Maybe you're going to get it graded and then you're going to sell it. If that's the case, again, is $112 meaningful enough to warrant you sending it in? It might be, but this is the methodology that I use to decide whether I send something or not. And so hopefully you found this video helpful. And if you did, I definitely want to encourage you to hit the thumbs up button, leave a comment behind, because I appreciate those comments and thoughts that people have. If you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so on Instagram at Regie Collects. Take care.